Well guys, gals, and those between, it's been about a week and we're back, so it's time to talk about the future of Silent Hill 2, the HD remake, remakes in general, and how video games just kinda need to do a better job of preserving their history. So sit back, relax, grab a frosty beverage, and let's dive right in. So to start, yes, Silent Hill 2 is only available on the PS2, which as of this recording is over 20 years old. If you've seen some of my other videos, a common trend of looking over media that's this old is me essentially advocating for piracy simply because a lot of these games I review have no physical or digital way to buy them besides secondhand sources. And with con artists ruining and inflating the used game market, this is now a case where piracy is in my opinion fine and valid because consumers have not been given other options or means to get this media. Now when it comes to their past, games are bad at this in particular and I don't know why. All they had to do was look at films and see that entire swaths of things that were made can be lost to the sands of time. Of the silent film era, it's been estimated that around 90% of all films of the time have been completely lost or only survive in mere still images or newspaper clippings heralding silent film stars of that era. So yes, we have newspapers that say so-and-so is one of the greatest actresses of all time, but we don't have any physical media to show us that. And the reason for this was the idea was you would see a film and that was it. And studios didn't want to pay for space for these films, so they would simply cycle it as raw material, or just simply discard them. This is eerily similar to the video game crash where Atari just dumped all their cartridges in the desert, or other publishers at the time who either folded and were bought out, and many of the source codes of those games were simply dumped because the company didn't exist and there was real no obligation to preserve those codes. Who knows how many games of that bygone era are just simply gone. Another issue that is again eerily similar to films is that a lot of these containers were not meant to last. Films were also lost because of the material they used, silver nitrate, that if you looked at it wrong would catch fire. There were quite a few major studio fires where reels not kept in optimal conditions burst into flames and caused many copies of movies to just be lost forever. The games are actually now facing that exact same crisis when it comes to older hardware. A lot of games that never left the floppy disk era are simply impossible to play without some kind of workaround. Try finding a modern CD with a built-in floppy disk drive, and like films, many of the older systems are now coming upon rot, where they are no longer able to play because the material they use simply won't work, or they rely on servers or specialized hardware to be backed up on. I even read somewhere that Nintendo 64 cartridges are going to be completely unplayable in I think 20-30 years, I don't know the exact number, but that day will come eventually. Which is why it's crazy no one's thought about this. People even in the 50s were talking about how films need to do better. So video games had a 50-year stretch of this is not how you do things. And video games and films were primarily different in how viewers consumed them. It wasn't until the 80s that owning and renting films were a common thing. Many of you might have parents or older who can remember the time they got a VCR and were able to own or record movies. I used to have a family member who says, yeah, before they would really only see movies in movie theaters because, again, the concept of owning it just wasn't around at the time. Well, in contrast, many Atari games, and yes, there were systems before Atari, but that's kind of the main one when you think of first video game systems, were arcade ports. So it was to own the arcade at home. There was always the idea from the inception of video games, this is something consumers want to own and is their property. But even today, it seems companies care little for that because it's profit-driven. For the video game crash, it made sense as to why a lot of these games were just lost. But even today, as I've stated before, many modern games, their source codes have been lost due to just negligence that I cannot fathom. Many times, assets were only found because developers kept them to put them on resumes. My only indication as to why games are so sloppy is known as the rule of fleeting demographics. This originated in comic books. The idea was only kids read comic books. So after a few years, you can repeat the exact same story. Because most of the people who would notice have stopped reading, or they're such a minor part of your business, their complaints won't matter, because again, most of your readers are a fresh batch of young kids. And this kind of makes sense. I think it was common for many people to have had a game system where they played it, and older family members typically played only sports games. For me, it was football or typically boxing. And that was it, we played Sonic and they played boxing. So I can surmise the idea was that we, the children, would get older and not play those games anymore. That it was a pastime meant for kids. This is in no way absolving video game companies as a whole, because yeah, that didn't happen. Now those kids are grown up, many with children or related to children still playing video games. It's frustrating to say the least. Let's say my sister wants to show her kids something like Toy Soldiers because, she loves that movie. She can do it rather easily. But let's say I want to show my nephew a game that was made around the same time. It's literally a crapshoot as to whether I can get it for him on a modern day system. It should not be this difficult to share things you enjoy. Even something like Jet Set Radio Future, a game I love, that's impossible. So I'm not talking about games from 40, 50 years ago. Even things about a decade old like the Wii has games like the Rebirth series by Konami that are locked by the Wii. So unless you hack it, which you should, you're out of luck. It was even a major story a year ago when Sony said they're shutting down the PS Store for the PSP and PS3, which would simply destroy some pieces of content and make them lost to the ether. Even if you want to play something like Homecoming, you'd have to whip out the PS3. Which, yeah, I get it, Homecoming isn't great, but even flawed art needs to be preserved. But this doesn't seem likely. Heck, there are entire YouTube shows dedicated to games you can't play anymore. While I find those shows entertaining, I do. At the end of the day, I would rather said videos not exist if I can actually play those pieces of media. Now there's more I can talk about regarding preservation of media, but that might be an entire video for an entire different day. This video is more of an opinion piece on how frustrating it is to play something from my youth. Konami tried with the HD remake, and well, it did not go great. Now there have literally been 1.5 million videos on this remake and just how they were made, but I will say this that a lot of people don't mention. This was around the time Konami was deciding to have Western developers make their games instead of the much lauded Team Silent. The reason why I can surmise is that this was the same generation where Capcom was making that big Western push. Which again, in hindsight, it was terrible, but I will always defend the intent. There were market reasons for deciding they needed to capture the Western market, since we were now becoming the forefront of the gaming world. But in Capcom's case, it just wasn't done well, and in Konami's, they never really gave their Western developers a chance. Hijinks Studios was now penned to do the HD collection of Part 2 and 3. Oh, we'll get to Heather one day. The issue is that Hijinks Studios only did 3 games before this, with 2 of them being DS titles like crossword games, and an entry in the Vandal Heart series of all things, which was also digital only, which I got for this op-ed, which was also almost impossible to play. If anyone has ever tried to buy something now on the PS3 store, yeah, it is literally impossible. I tried using my credit card, I tried using my PayPal, I tried using a separate credit card. The only thing that worked out of one of those prepaid Sony store cards, input the code to send money into my account and get it that way on my PC. That was the only way. So yeah, speaking of preservation, Sony also not doing a great job. So, new Vandal Hearts. I haven't played the originals, so I can't really compare, but knowing the people who watch these videos, they're probably gonna recommend me to actually go ahead and play them, so I might go ahead and do that. But man, that art style is a terrible choice. I played it for a bit, I thought it was okay. Looking at reviews, same thing, nothing special, nothing great, but it's not terrible. So even with Konami going west, why would they choose Hijinks for a major job like this? They only did 2 other games in a digital-only game. I cannot understand why. I feel like the management of Konami is so disconnected from the actual people developing. Because again, I've worked corporate jobs, so I feel like when I say, yeah, the suits upstairs have no idea what it's actually like down here, I feel like quite a lot of people watching these videos would nod in agreement. And with all the reports of Konami not being the best of their developers, I get the feeling that, yeah, the people at the top don't really know how to make a video game and just expect it to be done. Maybe they thought, well, Team Silent didn't know how to make a video game and they did it, so let's get Hijinks. They actually make games. That's ignoring the obvious fact that Silent Hill should have failed, and with tweaking a few things, I could have very easily seen the game never seeing the light of day. To make matters worse, Konami lost the source code because of course they did, because no one actually cares about preserving games. So Hijinks didn't have the final code, merely an older one that was buggy. So buggy they had to patch the game. Unless you bought it for Xbox, then you got no patch and Konami told you to, let me see my notes here, get So yeah, without that patch, the game isn't even playable. It's a broken, buggy mess. And even with the final product, oh boy, there were a lot of changes that were not great. And let's not blame Hijinks or Tom Hewlett for all this. They were not the right people for this job. They should have chosen another team. Hygiene Studios should have had the time to continue to grow and evolve as developers without this impossible task before them. All your rage should be directed solely at Konami for this. Concerning the HD remakes, the first obvious change was the voice acting. So to surmise it, the original voice actor of James wanted residuals for his work on the game, claiming that he owned the intellectual property of that performance and the motion capture associated with it. Contemporaries in the field came out and said that's just not the way it works, that's not how VAs get paid, and that it always belonged to Konami. So since he wasn't going to get his residuals, he wasn't interested in redoing lines for the game. He also claimed that it wasn't solely about the money, but rather the lack of respect that Konami had given him, which, well, they do have a track record of that, unfortunately. He specifically cited a few things, and unlike certain modern events, he didn't embellish aspects. According to him, they merely had a handshake deal, which, Jesus. I hope other VAs don't have that, because there's zero legal protections for handshake deals. That seems to be the case here because no one was able to find any contract between Guy Seehee, the original voice actor, and Konami. So yeah, there was not an official contract in any sense of the word. So yeah, I can see his point of view in that they didn't respect him. So the cast was replaced, and they're not great. Many are miscast or they're too good, which, let me explain. James is now being played by NFT shill Troy Baker, and he's a fine actor. But it feels like he has too much confidence in his tone. Guy Seehee just sounded depressed for a lot of his lines. And he was actually going through a divorce when the game was being made, so maybe that kind of rubbed off. Troy sounds less melancholic and more action-fueled.
A letter. The name on the envelope said Mary. My wife's name.
Letter. The name on the envelope said Mary. My wife's name.
He's not a bad VA. I recently saw him in the Super Sons movie, and NFC shill Troy Baker plays a decent Batman, which is a really big cape to fill. But here, he's not a brooding hero, and James kind of sounds like that. Angela is now replaced by Laura Bailey, who it might not be that she was miscast, but rather the direction was all wrong. Laura is fine, but she's just too professional. I'm a filthy weeb. I'm pretty much subs for life over here, so I wouldn't be able to judge. But she continues to get work, so she's obviously doing something right. And she's also voiced some of my favorite characters like Rise Kujikawa of Persona and was Lightning in Final Fantasy XIII, who was one of the few things that people liked about that series. It's just, again, here, she's too professional. The original Angela sounded from the start like she wasn't fully there. She seemed nervous, like she was going to have a breakdown at any moment, doing her best to hold it together. She's emotionally stunted and it shows. I don't really get that here, so I can really only blame the direction. Because again, she's a fine voice actress, but she's not portraying any of that emotional vulnerability the original Angela had. Which isn't her fault. That's up to the director.
Yeah. It's hard to see with this fog, but there's only the one road. You can't miss it.
Thanks.
But
Yes?
I think you better stay away. This town, there's something wrong with it.
Yeah. It's hard to see with this fog, but there's only the one road. You can't miss it.
Thanks.
But
Yes?
I think you'd better stay away. This town, there's something wrong with it. It's kind of hard to explain, but...
Is it dangerous?
Eddie is also okay, but, same complaints as last time. The one that really disappointed me the most was the elevator announce guy. The first guy really hams it up, and it's amazing. The second sounds like a modern game show host. He's fine, but, again, that first guy, it's hard to live up to.
Quickly, on to question number 2. Silent Hill witnessed a gruesome murder a few years back. Brother and sister were playing in the road when they were attacked and chopped into pieces with an axe.
Number 2. Silent Hill witnessed a gruesome murder a few years back. A brother and sister were playing in the road when they were attacked and chopped into pieces with an axe.
Laura is okay. Kid actors are either really loud or okay, no in between. No notes. The character that received the most backlash was Mary, being now voiced by Mary Elizabeth McLean, who supposedly herself felt her voice was a bit too deep for a character. I say supposedly because I couldn't find an actual source for this claim, besides people simply saying it, so take it with a grain of salt. Real life Mary is again someone who's been doing this for years, so any complaints should be given to Konami's decision. She's been working and doing VA work for close to 30 years, and even voiced Helba in Dot Hack. I swear I'll do a massive Dot Hack video one day, please just give me time. But sometimes people aren't a good fit for a role due no fault of their own. Partway through in the hospital, it's the best way to show. In the original, the actress can make a voice that's almost shrill, like nails on a chalkboard as she yells at you. Mary Elizabeth, she just doesn't have that same effect. It's still anger, but it's nowhere near as effective.
I'm glad you're alive.
Anyway? What do you mean, anyway? You don't sound very happy to see me. I was almost killed back there. Why didn't you try to save me?
Glad you're alive.
Anyway? What do you mean, anyway? You don't sound very happy to see me. I was almost killed back there. Why didn't you try to save me?
Thankfully, you can choose between the new and original voices. The new voices aren't bad, but suffer from either being miscast or just not having good direction. So again, that's Konami's fault and not the actor's fault. As for the game itself, I'm playing the actual patch version, which makes it playable. Yes, I said playable. When the game first came out, the game simply didn't work. There was no fog, and there were multiple game-breaking glitches. There was a first patch for Sony systems which did nothing. And a second patch that actually fixed the game and added some fog, but overall it fails to match the original. So much so that there's a fog mod for the PC version. It still sucks because if you say you don't have access to the internet, or if Sony shuts down the servers for the PS3 like they were planning to, those patches are gone and the game will just be unplayable. If you bought it for Xbox, well, you're already in that boat. Konami just said, it's too difficult, and decided not to patch the game for Xbox systems, which that's gotta suck. Imagine buying a $60 game that you can't physically play. So if you have a PS3, the servers are still on, the remake is okay. Keen-eyed observers have noticed some differences like washed out colors, so it really isn't as good as the original, but it's the best we can get for now and for the foreseeable future. After the HD remake, Silent Hill fans have not been eating well, to say the least. We've had a slew of games that were not great, and some decent ones like that odd remake of Part 1. For the most part though, we've been begging for just a crumb here and there. We're the Oliver Twist of the gaming world. This was made worse by the cancelled Silent Hills. Yeah, it's not that great of a title. I honestly hope they would have changed it. Which, circling back to the start of this video, nothing says game companies don't care than just removing PT or playable trailer completely. So if you're like me and didn't have the income for a PS4 at the time, unless you shell out an exorbitant amount of money, PT is just locked away. Art is locked away because there's no incentive to actually keep it up. So the next game in the series, Silent Hills, was going to be held by Hideo Kojima of Metal Gear Solid fame, starring Norman Reedus of The Walking Dead, and was not going to have famed mangaka Junji Ito. It was cancelled. I say not because Junji Ito himself has said he talked with Konami, but it was just that talks and it never went further, so who knows if he actually would have been on board. With Silent Hill cancelled and Konami doing nothing besides dipping their toes into the NFT thing, which everyone else did for some reason, and Pachinko, which is wildly popular in Japan, it seemed they just didn't care about their long dormant IP until suddenly they did. A few months ago, Silent Hills F was announced. This would be the first game not to be set in America, but rather a rural Japanese village. Which makes sense, the original was a rural American town after all. And they even got the writer of When They Cry, a multimedia series that goes well into horror, that also takes place in a location like that. So it's a good choice, and we know for sure that at least there's gonna be AC in that game. There's gonna be like 10 of you that are Higurashi fans who also watch this video that are gonna get that joke. That wasn't the only bombshell. It was also announced that we would see a remake of Silent Hill 2, which was out of nowhere. I want to be clear, I hope both these games do well and are amazing, but I need to also make clear that the Silent Hill 2 remake is not going to be the same thing as Silent Hill 2. What I mean by this is that in the 20 years since Part 2 was released, games have changed radically, especially horror games. One needs to only look at RE2 and RE2 Remake. The setting is the same, but the gameplay massively changes the experience. There's really no such thing as a game where you don't really control the camera, so a lot of the cinematography that went into the original is just not going to be there. Maybe in cutscenes, but not as the player moves and experiences it in real time. Another major change is the idea of trophies in video games, rewarding you for different aspects. This also has fundamentally changed how some people play and view video games. There are those who feel driven and make plans and roadmaps towards that elusive platinum trophy, which the original was never designed for. Sure, you can get 10 stars, but there was no reason and no incentive to besides doing it. Adding things like kill a certain amount of enemies with this weapon alters how one would play and approach the game that a developer wouldn't consider more than 20 years ago. What I just said, I would admit, is a really esoteric argument that many would probably disagree on. However, there is the idea of how much you can change something before it's no longer that original thing. Philosophers have argued about this for as long as there's been philosophy. When it comes to if it's better, that's a different argument that I'm not taking part in, but rather that the changes themselves result in a different product. A wholly different case would be that of the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Not only was the gameplay changed, but also the story, the characters, almost everything. Some were for the good, like changing Barret into what many considered a really bad racial stereotype, with the original English translation, to the finer points of his character, both as a loving father, a valiant protector of the planet, and sometimes a showboater, being the leader of Avalanche, doing his best to have bravado to show that he had everything under control. Whether it's arguing with Shinra executives or rallying the troops. That was all good, but besides no longer being turn-based combat, which is something we can expect for the 2 remake, they're gonna update fighting monsters for sure. The story of the 7 remake was so thoroughly different, it exists at its own separate canon at this point. But what if that wasn't the case? What if it followed in the vein of Crisis Core, which I heard is pretty faithful to the PSP original, just making quality of life updates? I still feel like the original, with its flaws, needs to be preserved and made playable. Same with Silent Hill 2. Even if it follows the route of Crisis Core, both 2 and the HD remake should be preserved and there should be a way to play these games legally. So often with these videos, I have to basically endorse piracy because there's no other option. Even Saga Frontier, sure the remake's available and you should play it, but the original is not available anywhere from any first-party source without the use of piracy. Again, I'm not trash-talking the upcoming remake. I hope it's good, I hope it's great, I hope I love it, but it won't be Silent Hill 2. It will be a different retelling of the same but similar story. And it's a damn shame that in the 20 years of its release, Konami has made it clear they care little about preserving their history or making a game that many love playable in some form and easily and legally obtainable. Well guys, gals, and those in between, that's the end of another video. I decided to separate it into 2 parts because I just felt like the Silent Hill 2 one was long enough and it deserved its own video. I'm thinking of doing a larger video on video game preservation in the future, but for now I got the next few lined up, so tune in next time as we learn about chaos. Stay blessed.